Okay, good morning, everybody, and thank you for coming to The View today. As always, we always want to say a huge and big thank you to Lessings, an amazing sponsor. If we could just give them a round of applause for this wonderful venue, and the New York League of Conservation Voters as well for helping us with these morning series. So I just want to say thank you very much. My name is Todd Shaw. I am president of Save the Great South Bay. I just want to go through our programs really quickly so you guys understand what we do every single day, it seems, at least in the summer. First of all is the Creek Defender program. We had 17 cleanups. We went through the numbers last night. I mean, I'm going to screw this up, Tom, but we had somewhere in the neighborhood of 7,000 pounds of garbage, yeah, just documented. And then, so that means that there's probably about 15,000 pounds of garbage that we picked up. We had an average of about 50 or 60 people at each cleanup. We now have a creek defender in every one of the towns along the Great South Bay. There's 16 of them from Massapequa to Mastic. And we have a bunch of creek defenders in the room today. So thank you for all those efforts. It was just amazing. The second thing we do is our Great South Bay Oyster Project, which is just in its second year now, and we have 3 yacht clubs, 4 if we include Sayville, where we have nurseries, 10 crates. Oh, and we're over at Salt Air, just started on Fire Island as well, so we're just kind of infiltrated on Fire Island over there. So we have 10 crates at each one of the clubs. Umpqua, Babylon Yacht Club, Bayshore Yacht Club, Sayville Yacht Club has 10 or 20 crates. And we're growing out anywhere between 15 and probably 50 or 60,000 oysters at each one of those locations. We also have 2 sanctuaries that we put them in. I can't tell you where they are, but they're in wonderful places. Andy and I went out just a couple weeks ago. We found that we planted them first time in September of last year. One area had a 55-60% success rate. The other area had a 90% success rate of those oysters surviving, and it was amazing. I mean, unbelievable. So that, with all the oyster farmers doing a phenomenal job, and what's going on, with their grow out efforts, who knows? We might see single sets oysters somewhere, sometime that we never put somewhere. So that's really the goal. And then our third program is our advocacy and education program, which is part of this series and other things that we do. So with that, I'd like to hand it over to our executive director, Robin Silvestri.
Thank you, Todd. So hello, everybody. My name is Robin Silvestri. I'm the executive director for Save the Great South Bay. And I want to just start by saying I love the Bay. I raised my family on the Bay. I paddleboard, I boat. I'm not much of a fisherman, but I do spend a lot of time on the Bay. One of my favorite things to do is to drive across the Robert Moses Bridge. I consider it almost like a meditation. It's so beautiful. That, and then the Captree Bridge, you get to see the inlet and the ocean all at once. So it's what drives my passion for Great South Bay and this organization. And based on our recent retreat, it's what drives all of our board members, and I'm sure most of our volunteers too, who come out and support our organization. So thank you for joining us today. I'd like to introduce our board members who are here with us. We have Todd Shaw, our president, Rihanna Quinn-Roddy, Wayne Horsley, Tom Kane, Andy Michelle, and Bill Zeller. So thank you for joining us. Oh, and James Birch. I'm sorry. James is our newest board member, and he doesn't make it always on my list yet. I got writing your name down, James. I'd also like to thank our creek defenders who are here. And if I forget your name, please raise your hand. Walt Meschenberg, Janet Soley, and Ed Reagan, who are here. Their work in supporting our creek defenders is indispensable. Did I see any hands out there? Okay, great. Also, I'd like to thank the public officials who take the time to come out and listen to our advocacy efforts. They are fantastic public partners for us, and we can't do what we do without their support. Today, we have representatives of Congressman Garbarino's office, representatives from the Senate, the Assembly, Jarrett Gandolfo, a huge supporter of our organization, Legislator McCaffrey's office. Legislator McCaffrey recently took over as the presiding officer and is really pushing through some groundbreaking legislation that is going to help us save the Great South Bay. More of that is to come. We also have representatives of Patchogue Village, the USDA, the DEC, and the South Shore Estuary Reserve. I'd like to welcome particularly Chris Clapp into his new role as the director of the South Shore Estuary Reserve. Chris, could you just stand up for a second? Thanks for joining us today, Chris. I'd also like to give a shout out to our partners on our Unified Water Study. This is a collaborative program. The name is in the works. It's a water quality monitoring program that we're doing from Hempstead out to Shinnecock in a unified way to allow us, the end goal is to create a report card. I'm not a water quality scientist. Few of the people who I work with or volunteer for our organization are water quality scientists, except Maureen and Nancy and Carolyn. It's important for us to be able to understand what the science means. We're a science-driven organization. We look to follow what the science says. And so we are, while there's no lack of water quality data being collected across the South Shore Estuary Reserve, it's not being collected in a unified way, so we can't compare the numbers. So our collaborative water quality monitoring program will allow us to collect data from Hempstead to Shinnecock in a unified way and be able to create letter grades for the water quality. For me, I have 4 kids. To understand what a letter A means versus a letter D is very easy, versus milligrams of nitrogen and blah, blah, blah. That's what it sounds like to me. So that's one of our great initiatives. I'd like to say thank you to Maureen Dunn, Nancy Pearson, and Carolyn Sukowski for leading up our water quality monitoring teams this year. I'd also just like to say once again thank you to our sponsors, Lessings Hospitality and the New York League of Conservation Voters. We can't do what we do without the support of our sponsors. Oh yes, Village of Amityville is here. Dennis Seary. Dennis, thank you for joining us today. So with that, I'd like to introduce our panel today. We're joined by a great group of specialists. I'm going to start with Brian Zittani over on the left. Brian Zittani is with the Department of Environmental Control and Waterways Management for the town of Babylon. He manages their program operations for the Bay Management Division, including off-bottom seed clam and spat-on-shell oyster grow-outs, stocking and management of hard clams, spawner sanctuaries, and annual shellfish population surveys, among a host of other things that Brian does for the town of Babylon. Then we have next to him is Dr. Jeff Levinton. He's a distinguished professor at the Stony Brook University and a marine ecologist. Dr. Levinton has researched the benthic community structure, the ecology of bivalve mollusks, which for me, again, is clams and oysters, and the evolution of marine species, including their adaptation to toxic substances and macroevolution. His work on shellfish includes studies of the mechanisms of filter feeding of oysters and other bivalves, regional distributions, population genetics, and the behavior particularly of fiddler crabs. Yep, thank you for joining us, Dr. Levinton. It's a pleasure to have you. Next up, we have Harrison Tobi, a shellfish and aquaculture specialist from Cornell Cooperative Extension. Harrison attended the University of Vermont, where he majored in fisheries biology. After graduating, he took a job assisting in research and farm management with Ward Aqua Farms in Woodhulls, is it Massachusetts? Massachusetts, thanks. During his time there, he oversaw multiple commercial oyster farm locations, as well as the development and management of multiple grant-funded aquaculture research projects. Harrison earned his master's degree in marine biology at the University of Mass, Dartmouth, and he manages Cornell Cooperative's Bay Scallop Restoration Program, overseeing all aquaculture and research activities. Thank you for joining us, Harrison. And finally, last but not least, we have a new friend of the organization, Billy Hart. Billy is a longtime proprietor of Hart Lobsters and Hatchery, which is located in Sayville. And what happens at a hatchery is baby oysters are spawned so that they can be used out on the oyster farms and in spawner sanctuaries to help restore them to the bay. Billy was born and raised on Long Island, and he began working with shellfish in islip waters at The young age of 14, so pretty young, has an interest in the oyster in his hatchery. He has worked with various shellfish, specializing in oysters and quahog clams, which we may hear a little bit more about, before becoming a lobster distributor under the name of Heart Lobsters. He opened his oyster hatchery in 2011, and he has seen the water quality diminish, which led to his interest in saving Long Island waterways. His life on the water, mainly the Great South Bay, and working with shellfish, prompted his advocacy to restore the salt water around Long Island. So he's a soul brother to us. Thank you, and then thanks for joining us, Billy. And then finally, I'd like to introduce our distinguished moderator, Bill Blyer. He's a renowned Newsday journalist, prize-winning author. He was on staff for Newsday for 33 years, specializing in history and maritime issues, before retiring in 2014 to write books and freelance for a multitude of newspapers and magazines. He has several books up in the front that he's authored if you're interested in purchasing them. This Hofstra graduate has taught economics and journalism at Hofstra and at the Webb Institute and at the Naval Architecture College in Glen Cove. So welcome to our panel and our moderator. Thanks everyone for joining that. And with that, I'm going to hand over the mic to Bill Blyer. Thank you.
Can everybody hear in the back? Okay. Yes? Okay, great. Thank you, Robin. Thank you, Tom. The other reason, probably the main reason I wanted to do this today is I have a lot of hats, one of which Robin didn't mention, which is I am president of Friends of the Bay, the Oyster Bay Cold Spring Harbor Environmental Group. We have a lot of the same interests, a lot of the same kind of activities going on, shellfish restoration projects, water quality monitoring. So I sort of want to get a sense of what you folks did down here, and maybe we can set up some joint programming, both this kind of discussion and also maybe hands-on projects out in the water. But more about that later. Okay, so let's jump right in. I think we'll start with the most basic thing is, what are we talking about when we talk about aquaculture or mariculture? And I guess we'll start with Dr. Levinson, and then the other panelists can jump in.
Okay, good morning, everybody, and thank you all for coming here. And we all share this great love for the waters of Long Island, and particularly Great South Bay, which has been an amazing place for history. I mean, it used to be Blue Point oyster, gone. Amazing populations of clams, gone. Water quality, superb, not so great. So when we look at the world, you could be very pessimistic. And what aquaculture is an interesting question in that context. And I wanted to tell you just a quick anecdote. I was in Australia, maybe about 24 years ago, about 2000, and I was in a boat with a friend, and we met another boat, and there was a guy there named Dave, and Dave was very rich. He was an oyster farmer, and there are a lot of oyster farmers in Southeast Australia. And I was talking with him for a while, and he had these things they call French sticks, which is a lovely name, but which is the thing where oyster larvae settle. And he said to me, you're from New York, and I just read this book by a man named Mark Kurlansky, and he said, how did you screw up so badly and get rid of all of your oysters and all of your oyster farms? And I thought, well, we did, but we also have lots of oyster farms in America as well. And I didn't point out to him that there were absolutely no oyster reefs left in Southeast Australia. They were gone, as they are gone in most of the world. What we have left in Southeast Australia are oyster farms. There is a very good project going on in South Australia that may bring back oysters, but I'm a little skeptical. So we have this interesting problem that it's easy to raise certain things like oysters, and the natural environment is gone. And yet when we come back and look at what you can do, it's easy to raise clams, it's easy to raise oysters, and it's easy to put them in cages. So we immediately think that we want to know what their benefits might be. So that's one issue And that is that we think there are benefits perhaps, but we know that there are profits and food involved. So that's a driving force, and it's going to be a driving force in this region. It already is a driving force in this region. If you buy a mussel on your table, you know where it's from. It's not from anywhere around here. It's from Prince Edward Island, most likely. If you get an oyster, it could very well be from some magnificent oyster farms that are right in this region, like in Connecticut and Long Island Sound and other places. So that's an interesting problem. But we also want to restore back the environment. And then there's a belief, perhaps, that the oysters can do something. So I'm going to say one more thing, and that is that are there benefits of doing both? And my answer is there must be. And I'm very happy that there is kind of a twofold type of attitude in this region and everywhere around the world. And that is to continue to try to look at what the benefits of aquaculture might be and mariculture, but also to try to bring back these populations. And I will warn you that bringing back these natural populations, you should be a skeptic, because it's very hard to do. And those of you, I think, in this room, a lot of you know of the tremendous effort to try to bring back clams here after they were overexploited. And it wasn't a very successful effort. So we have to be realistic. But there are interesting prospects, and I just want to mention one, and it was a study that I supervised a number of years ago, looking at Jamaica Bay and Great South Bay. And I think it won't surprise you that there's more nutrients coming into the water in Jamaica Bay than Great South Bay. But it's not a factor of 100, it's about a factor of 10 more than here. And in Jamaica Bay, there have been very good policies by the New York Department of Environmental Protection, and they've brought down the nitrogen input by 60% over the last 15 years. It's an amazing effort done by basically the people in charge of the sewage treatment plants. They've really done an excellent job. And there's also an indigenous group of people who defend the Jamaica Bay environment. And by the way, that's a place that is in very serious decline, but they are fighting and they're doing a wonderful job, and they've caused the increase of water quality by screaming and yelling. Now, the reason why I mention this is that we were interested in whether you could use aquaculture and mariculture in Jamaica Bay or Great South Bay to help improve the water quality. And the answer is absolutely yes. And the interesting thing is that some of the solutions for natural populations and farm populations are fairly similar, because oysters suspension feed. They take up nitrogen, and then you can harvest the oysters. So the question we asked is, with a harvesting strategy, could you clean up the water of Great South Bay given the nitrogen that's coming in? And the answer is, with 5,000 acres of coverage, which is a large amount of coverage, it's close to the maximum that was originally suggested. With 5,000 acres of coverage, you could take up 146% of the nitrogen that comes into this bay. Now, this, of course, thinks, can we really be irresponsible? Should we stop reducing release of nitrogen in the bay? Well, that's silly, but it does mean that there is a tremendous benefit of shellfish. Just by collecting them, removing them, you're removing nitrogen, and you're selling them for eat. So it's kind of you're getting 2 for 1. You're getting a profit for the food you're raising, and you're getting a benefit for clarifying water. So there are benefits of mariculture. There are other benefits that have been investigated in this region. For example, interactions between seaweed and bivalves increasing water quality. So the potential for aquaculture to improve water quality, there have been a number of very good techniques, which I think we're going to hear some examples, and I'm going to stop 1 second to hear those. So there is reason for optimism, but there is a reason for pessimism, and that is that we have really degraded this environment very significantly. And how we bring that back is a very interesting problem. Not all of it has proven to be solved by efforts.
We're going to come back to it.
Yeah. So I think I'll stop there.
Yeah, Dr. Levitin hit a lot of the points we're going to get into in more detail. But
yeah, I was told to start doing that. So.
No, that's fine. We're going to pick up a lot of the threads individually. But let me go back to the original question. People hear mariculture, they hear aquaculture. Are they the same thing? What exactly are we talking about?
They are the same thing. Mariculture just refers to marine aquaculture. Aquaculture is the process of raising organisms in some sort of constrained environment. It could be in a tank, but it could be out in open water. So one of the sad examples of mariculture to me are salmon farms. They have tremendously negative effects, but there also bivalve farms that were started in Portugal where for mussel farms, and the mussels pooped, and all the poop went right to the bottom and made the bottom anoxic and killed off all the organisms beneath. But mariculture and aquaculture are the same thing. It's the raising of things. Our concern here in Great South Bay is the raising of natural species in the open water environment. So we're worried about the benefits that they might have to the open water environment and the damage that you might perform by, for example, putting thousands of acres of oyster cages. So there are benefits and costs, but same thing.
Okay, we're going to come back to that too. So let's move to Billy Hart and talk about SPAT. I'm not sure everybody here actually knows what SPAT is, so you might start with defining that.
Larval oysters.
You want to use that?
You got to turn it on. Get off my cord. Spat. Spat is, one of the familiar terms of it is spat on shell, which is oyster larvae that's set on shell, and that would become spat. That's what they use for the reefs, for building all the reefs and so on. What I do is we grow larvae. We spawn oysters. We start in January, and we spawn through July, sometimes into August. But what we've found in the last 3 or 4 years is that we cannot, the hatchery is in West Sayville, which is about a mile to the east of here. And we have been very unsuccessful trying to spawn oysters in the waters of the Great South Bay because it's highly toxic. We have brown tides, red tides, rust tides, is all different, as you know what they are. But what we found out in the last 2 years is that along with the brown tides that we have, the diatoms retain a cyst inside of the diatoms. So we're talking things that are very, very tiny. Now, when the diatoms die, as they do, they settle to the bottom and they decompose. At that time, the cysts burst. And when a cyst bursts, I believe it's called Scripsiella. It's highly toxic. It kills 100% of all shellfish larvae. It doesn't affect humans, doesn't affect fish. It kills every piece of larva from shellfish. And these are the things, and it always happens at the same time when the oysters are spawning. The diatom will die when the water temperature hits around 70, 72 degrees. It goes again, and around 73, 75 degrees, the oysters, the clams, the mussels, they all spawn. It's 100% mortality. This paper written by Stony Brook, by Dr. Goldberg, I believe, wrote it. Very informative. So now, in order to combat that, because it's a toxin and it's so fine, we can't filter it out of the water. So what I've done for my larva phase in the hatchery is I've moved my hatchery out to Matatuck, where the water is clean, there's not as much Scripsiella in it, and this Scripsiella is in every body of water around the world. It's not, just here.
Can you speak up? We're having trouble hearing you back.
Oh, all right.
Yeah, just hold the mic closer.
Okay. So it's, it's all over the world, but when it's in concentrations like when we have a brown tide is when it'll kill all larvae. And that's pretty much what we have to try to get rid of now. I believe the way to get rid of it is through aquaculture. If we start growing oysters, the adult oysters are not affected. So if we start letting farmers put cages and racks and floating apparatus out in the Great South Bay with millions and millions of oysters, they will consume all those diatoms and it will thin out the population. And if it's done, if there's enough of it happening, it will eliminate or severely reduce the amount of this toxins in the water. And that's what I'm trying to get done. And the farmers right now that I deal with selling seed to are desperate for seed. There is no seed. A lot of the hatcheries up and down the coast have had significant problems trying to rear oyster seed. But Cornell has been, instrumental in helping us, showing us ways to doing it, different types of filtration systems, and basically trying to clean up the environment.
Follow-up question for you and the panel. Is the spawning and working with the larvae the same it's always been for years, or are there new techniques coming in? Yeah,
Yeah,
the
it's
growing
been-
and the harvesting.
Actually, the system, the method that we use is called the Glancy-Wells method, and it was invented by a man by the name of Joe Glancy. He actually has a patent on it. He had a patent on it in 1962. Unfortunately, he died in '63. But he was an MIT graduate. He was a genius. He knew everything about the great. On his death, University of Rutgers, don't remember the professor's name, said he was the most knowledgeable man of oysters on the planet at the time. I don't know who is now, but it ain't me.
Okay. I guess we'll get back to what Dr. Levinson started, and we'll open it up to anybody. We talked about how oysters can clean up the water. Let's talk more about how that works, and also what about clams? I mean, clams, I know up on the North Shore, clams seem to survive better, have less problems with predators. So if you could talk about both.
All filter feeders would help clean the water.
Okay.
They take the nitrogen out of the water, the carbon dioxide. But if they stay in the water and they die, the nitrogen is re-released. So the idea is you have to grow the oysters to market size, harvest them, and then put fresh oysters in to reduce the nitrogen level.
Okay, you better hold the mic a little closer, I think.
The other really effective way of eliminating nitrogen is with sugar kelp. 4 years ago, we started raising sugar kelp, and we've been seeing great success with it. Sugar kelp grows in the winter. We started in November, it's deployed in December, and it's harvested in May. So it doesn't interfere with boat traffic, in marinas, when the boats are gone. And the best place to put it, we've had it in Oyster Bay, Huntington Harbor, Moriches Bay, Peconic, and we also they did an experiment in Newtown Creek towards the city. And that was probably one of the most polluted bodies of water you could find. And after it grew very well, and after they harvested it, they went to test it to see they want to use it as fertilizer. And it was so toxic, there were so many toxins in it that they couldn't use it. They couldn't even put it in a dump site, because I guess Newtown Creek is not a real nice spot. But anyway, what they did was, which was very inventive, they dried it out, they ground it up, and they mixed it with concrete, and they put it in foundations. So now all this toxicity is gone. It's in cement for years and years. So that's probably one of the better ways. You know, the oysters is wonderful. They clean up the environment. It's great economic impact for people, for jobs. But the kelp is right alongside of it. It's the next best thing.
Okay, we're going to come back to kelp in a minute. The figure that's always bandied around is that an oyster will filter 50 gallons of water a day. Is that the same for clams, or?
I'm not really sure about that. I mean, they do filter a lot of water. If you come down to the hatchery and look in our adult tank, you'll see it's quite a mess. They do pump ferociously, depending on the size of the oyster. You know? But I don't know what the volume.
Any other thoughts?
Maybe the doctor does.
Clams are every bit as good as oysters. And one of the things that has been suggested is that there's some tipping point. As all of the clams were removed in Great South Bay, the water quality changed. And it precipitated these toxic algal blooms, not only here, but other parts of the South Shore of Long Island. And something that's really interesting, there's a gigantic population of clams in Jamaica Bay. And not only that, Jamaica Bay has beautiful phytoplankton for bivalve growth. Not only that, oysters grow, if you put an oyster in Jamaica Bay, it grows faster than any place else in this region. Even though Jamaica Bay has enormous nitrogen input, and I can't explain why that's so, but and there are almost no oysters in Jamaica Bay, naturally, by the way.
It's polluted also.
It's polluted, but I once went to somebody in the DEC, And I said, I could make people rich in Jamaica Bay by growing oysters there if you'd allowed them to be depurated. And I got a one-word answer from the person in D.C. She said, never. But on the other hand, back in the 60s, that same D.C. gave a license for clamming to the Blue Point Clam Company. And they came into Jamaica Bay, and they started clamming for one day, and a certain enterprising person in Jamaica Bay who was pretty angry about this and had some influence for the local congressman went and got their license revoked. But there are large populations there. So there's some mysteries that we don't understand about this interaction, about how clams and oysters and mussels interact with the phytoplankton and how the phytoplankton, but we know that the phytoplankton along this shore is largely toxic. And I'll bet everybody in this room knows that because it's very well known. And Chris Gobler, who's been working on this for many years, has really been just a tremendously productive scientist, but he's also discovered how important this is. And one of the interesting things is that this recent resurgence of clams growing in Shinnecock Bay seems to, I'm not sure it may be a coincidence, but there really haven't been toxic algal blooms the last couple of years there. So I think there's this very interesting synergistic interaction between clams, mussels, and oysters and the phytoplankton and the health of it. And that might be the secret to getting it back. And that was a good point about maybe if we had a bunch of oysters in the bay, maybe that would get rid of those toxic phytoplankton for a while, and we'd get back a different type of populations. But that's a speculation.
Do you think it's is it the algae that's toxic or the cysts that grow on them? Because all the algae in the Great South Bay can be eaten by clams. It's only when it's in dire concentrations when it chokes them out.
Well, there are several species of algae in blooms here, the so-called brown tide,
right,
which are absolutely toxic to bivalves at any concentration.
Oh.
But I think that we don't entirely understand this dynamic because we unfortunately just got rid of all of the clams here in Great South Bay,
right,
and at that same time you started seeing these blooms. Now, it's hard to know whether that's causality, and I would be the
sure
last
it's
one.
one of the causes.
It's
without a
likely to
doubt.
be, but
Yes.
right now I'm a scientist, and to me it's a correlation.
Okay.
And is correlation causality? Maybe. In this case, I intuitively think it is.
Because we've had toxic algae blooms, in our hatchery when the water's so thick it looks like black coffee. But we have a saltwater well. It's a pure saltwater well that we can dilute it out. And it's once you dilute it out with the well, which is basically what you're saying, clean up the nitrogen and then the larva can survive on it. If it's small enough, it has to be under 5 microns in size in order for the larva to consume it. So there is if you get an algae bloom of stuff that's 20 microns in size, it's going to kill them all because they're going to starve to death.
Oysters can eat 20 micron size algae.
Not at larva size.
Not at larvae, no.
Right.
The adults can.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, the larvae you have to really have a tight control. So this is a real problem. If you have a hatchery in a place where there's nothing but toxic blooms, you're finished. You have to go. And that's what you've done. You've gone somewhere else.
That's what we've had in the last 3 years. That's why we moved out to Mattatuck because it's clean, much cleaner water out there.
Let me get back to the clam oyster issue. It seems like all the money, all the pilot projects is pretty much oysters, and part of the reason I think is because oyster reefs, if they establish themselves, have a lot of other benefits for other marine life, for erosion control, storm damage, and the clams, because they're buried, don't do that. But at least on the North Shore, the clams have a much higher survival rate and less predators. Is the emphasis on oysters misplaced at all, or is that where the money should go?
They grow twice as fast.
The oysters, okay.
And they're worth twice as much.
Why don't you say that into the mic?
With the oysters, they grow twice as fast as clams, and they're worth twice as much in the market.
Okay, so there's an economic benefit.
There was I don't know how many. It was a while ago, but there was a magazine that came out. It was a cooking magazine that said that oysters is the most popular food on the planet right now because they're in every nation. And a Blue Point oyster is known all over the world.
Right. Okay.
But in all fairness, this bay sustained thousands of people with clams, and it was just the exploitation that ended it. It was and right now down the road in Shinnecock Bay, there is a clam fishery that is expanding, and it is providing sustenance for a number of fishermen. And it is absolutely true that oysters produce a lot of profit and people want to eat them, and there is an obsession about oysters. Prince William would have not come to Long Island to see clams. He went to look at oysters with the Million Oyster Project. That's the way it is. Oysters they really grab your attention.
Yeah, well, you can tell the price differential in restaurants is pretty substantial. Let's go back to kelp. You mentioned, Billy, one of the places we're doing that is Oyster Bay. The results up there have not been great. The only place it seemed to work was right by the town marina. When we did it, when it was done in other places, when they pulled it in the spring, there was either very little growth or no growth. So, how important is it to find the right place, and does it vary from harbor to harbor?
It does vary. Oddly enough, the more polluted the water, the better the kelp grows. So the idea of working in a marina inside the harbors and stuff is where the most pollution is. If you go out into the sound where it's cleaner, it's not, and also it's new right now. A lot of the people that are doing it are just learning the process of how to deploy it, how to take care of it, how to watch it. There's been a lot of, one of the things that happened, Islip did it, they were successful except for the fact that you have to have the kelp at least 2 feet underwater. And they had it too high, and what happened was the geese and the swans came and ate it all. They just took it away. So they came in, the middle of the line had kelp on it, but the ends had nothing on it because they stripped it clean. So it's a learning curve right now to try to figure out where to put it, and you do have restraints as far as you can't put it in a channel where there's boat traffic going by because they'll run it over. Nobody wants to hit it. So it really is a good, it's a good product to put close to sewage treatment plants, in the ends of bays and harbors, up against the shorelines, wherever you have 5 to 6 feet of water, because it needs a little bit of depth to do it. But it's, and the uses for it, they use it for pharmaceuticals. They use it for a lot of different things. And one of the problems we have with the kelp right now is there's no infrastructure. If you have a bunch of oyster farmers growing thousands and thousands of pounds of kelp, and they come in May with a boatload of kelp, 40,000 pounds, where do you unload it? Where do you take it? Where do you dry it? How do you process it? Who's going to sell it? There's a whole infrastructure thing that still has to be worked on. But I see it in the future, it's going to be great. I mean, it's going to help clean up the bays, and I'm looking forward to it moving on.
Tobi, you have some expertise in that too, right?
What's that?
Tobi, I think, has history with that also.
I mean, we grew kelp through a NOAA-funded project on Cape Cod. It grew okay, but one of the things that kelp does, it doesn't just clean the water. I'm from Vermont. I grew up in the woods, 600 acres of land. My dad was a forester, so I'm just going to use trees as an example. We all know trees absorb carbon dioxide. We know climate change is an issue. We know greenhouse gases, one of the big ones is carbon dioxide. Kelp also absorbs carbon dioxide. So not only if we were able to find successful methods and locations to grow kelp, not only are we cleaning the water, but we're helping reduce greenhouse gases. Additionally, we're also bringing funding into our local communities, which is a big part of aquaculture, and I think is a very important thing right now, trying to revive these communities, fishing communities that we're seeing. You know, we're talking about clams disappearing, oysters disappearing. So right now, basically, aquaculture is kind of our answer to bring back the local dockside revenue in a big way, and I think kelp, once we get there, it's going to be huge, but right now the big thing is infrastructure, drying facilities, so that's kind of the main roadblock right now. If Mike Dole was here, he might talk about some of his work he's been doing with Paul McCormick over in Moriches. Paul is doing a very interesting method where they're actually just, instead of doing lines up at the surface, he's just growing kelp right on the bottom, and anecdotally, he was telling me that he's having really good success right now doing it that way, and it's a pretty clean body of water, but he grows it right next to his oysters, and the oysters poop, and that nutrients goes right to the kelp, and the kelp seems to be doing pretty well, he was telling me. So there's a lot of research going on. It's hopeful.
Great. So I want to get Brian Zatani into this. Let's talk about what Town of Babylon has been doing, successes and failures.
Everybody can hear me? Oh, okay.
Yes.
I'm not one to be known for being quiet, so may or may not need the mic. Again, my name is Brian Zatani. I'm the Waterways Manager for Town of Babylon. I've been with the town for 39 years. Historically, the town first started getting into aquaculture back in 1978. It was actually when my department was formed. For the first 2 years, we did on-bottom culture of sea clam. Very modest proposals. We were doing about 200,000. Most of the towns have some type of shellfish program. I think Babylon, similar to many of the other towns. At the end of the 70s is when we kind of saw the end of the hard clam boom. We were giving out over 2,000 commercial permits just in the town of Babylon. Hard clam industry, between just combination of water quality issues, habitat destruction over the decades, and then just with the overharvesting, just took it down to a level where it was more of a reaction to bringing the clams back from a commercial standpoint. There was no intent for environmental improvement or impact to the bay. This was really trying to keep these guys working, keep the industry growing. And probably for about the first 20 years of our program, that was the intent. We were trying to bring hard clam industry back to the town of Babylon, but more from a commercial standpoint. Around that time was when then more of the research was coming out that these populations did have a positive environmental impact on water quality and on the bay in general. So as time went on, we expanded to doing, again, predominantly sea clams. We were doing 1 million to 2 million sea clams a year in off-bottom culture, distributing that in areas in the town that we knew had good water quality and good bottom quality for clams. You earlier, the topic has always been brought up on scale. 2 million sea clams in the town of Babylon in Great South Bay is a thimble full of clams. We know we are not bringing the clam population back with that. We know it's helping. At the very best, we believe it's helping maintain our current stocks. Our annual surveys, we have not seen a significant population increase in hard clams in the bay. Fortunately, we're not seeing a decrease either. So we believe, right now we're kind of holding our own. I believe the estimate is about 15 adult clams per square meter is kind of the accepted number for a thriving population. We're in the 5 to 7, and we've been there for about 40 years. So that's where our numbers are. About 20 years ago, we started working with Town of Islip. Quite frankly, I don't think either of our administrations knew we were working with each other, but because Islip had the hatchery and they had the ability to grow the shellfish, my goal is to have a working hatchery in Babylon. Like I said, I've been here 39 years. We still don't have a working hatchery in Babylon. So that's a reality. Government agencies have a limited amount of funding. Hatcheries are a 24/7 operation. You need a facility location. For a waterfront community such as mine in Western Great South Bay, what people fail to recognize is 98% of our shoreline is private property. In Babylon, it's residential. We also share the waterfront with 3 villages, so those incorporated villages have jurisdiction over their land. We, quite frankly, do not have a lot of waterfront property that we have control over. So that has been a limiting factor in terms of any type of expansion on the programs. What we feel we've been doing right, though, has been off-bottom, on-bottom culture, as well as direct introduction. We've been doing that pretty steadily since our program began. When we do our surveys, we GPS the tracks. Everybody always asks where I GPS tracks. No, I'm not going to give them to anybody, especially the commercial guys. But we can go back and we can actually see if they're surviving. We can tell from the size of the clams and the oysters exactly how long they've been in there. We know when we dumped them. So we at least have good information that all water quality is good, that they are surviving. Some of the negative things, Again, a lot of the policies that we were following and coming from the state DEC was when the clamming industry was dropping, there was a lot of concern about basically from health concerns. They didn't want people harvesting from the uncertified areas. If anybody's not familiar with that, bacteria levels have to be below a certain number in the bay for areas to commercially shellfish and to now bring those shellfish to market for human consumption. About 1/3 of the northern part of the bay has permanently been closed to these areas. So in the late 1970s, the state started doing relay programs where they would relay adult shellfish populations from polluted to clean waters. They cleaned out about 32,000 bushels of clams out of the Babylon Cove in a 3-year process. And 2 years later, Stony Brook released their drift survey from the early 1980s, where they were pretty much estimating where everybody's spawner stock was, and Babylon Cove was estimated as a spawner stock. So we literally wiped out the spawner stock for our area. You could always talk to Bill. Bill has had our bid for 25 plus years. Over 25 years, we put about 20,000 bushels of clams back into that area, trying to reestablish a natural spawning stock. We have not seen any significant change. We are seeing seed appearing in Babylon. We don't think we're quite there yet number-wise, because obviously clams that we put in, we started the program in '86, so obviously those adult clams have passed on and are no longer viable anymore. Our big issue right now is trying to expand. Again, I just had a budget meeting with my administrators on Tuesday, and every time I ask for any significant increase in funding, it's tough to get. My bay management program is a staff of 2. It's myself and my coworker who's a bay manager. My first summer with the town was the greatest summer ever. I spent 5 days a week on our off-bottom trays doing nothing but aquaculture. I'm lucky if I spend 5% of my time right now in mariculture work, and my coworker spends even less time. It's just a reality of government when they hear them say doing more with less. We're doing more in other departments, but not with that stuff. We're doing a lot of coordination now with groups such as Save the Great South Bay. We're also getting a lot of volunteer groups coming in. A lot of pressure to do leasing programs. We think we have a lot of potential acreage for that. Putting a program like that together requires staff time, an inordinate amount of staff time, which we currently don't have. So that's something that's I would like to see changed over time. So I would say for, at least in our case, we're holding our own, but we're not doing anything of scale in terms of a water quality or from a species management that is going to see any major increases, in the next, decade or so.
So, Brian, you mentioned off-bottom and on-bottom growing. Let's talk about the process. I mean, there's a lot of debate about where, once you have the spat and the seed, do you put it on the bottom? Do you keep it in cages, then put it on the bottom? What do you folks think is the best way to actually get these things to grow to maturity?
We typically do off-bottom. On-bottom was early on just because it was low technology. It was very simple. We do the off-bottom for 2 reasons. Again, the shellfish are cold-blooded. The warmer the water, the quicker they grow. With our seed clams, if we just buy, seed, typically 3 to 5 millimeter, about the size of our, on popcorn kernel. If we just put those directly in the bay, it's probably going to take 3 to 4 years for them to even make it to little neck, which is harvestable size. And at least at that size, they're going to start reproducing and putting out, sexually mature, putting out stuff. Oysters, we can get to legal size in 1 season. We have really good algae in the south part of the bay and in our growing areas. We've had several research candidates do grow outs all along Long Island, and they're always telling us they're getting some of the greatest results in the Babylon's marina over at our Cedar Marina facility. So we have fantastic growing conditions there. They can't go to market because you literally take an adult oyster and crush it in your hand. They're growing so quickly they don't put enough shell down. So you usually have to overwinter them. But to that earlier statement, from a marketing standpoint, yeah, you can get a oyster crop to market in half the time of a hard clam. So
do
there's an
they-
economic interest in that.
So they're going from cages right to market then, or are you putting them on the bottom?
Ours is strictly population replenishment.
Okay.
So all of the shellfish that we raise in Babylon, we have designated deposition areas that we are putting them back out into the bay. 90% of them go in open areas, so they would be available for harvest, whether recreationally or commercially. We do put a percentage of ours also in the closed areas, so they can't be legally harvested, and at least in those situations, they will just continue on, just surviving.
Are they going into sanctuaries where nobody can touch them?
We have our sanctuaries. We also have, because the bay is very large, and the sanctuary is a very limited area, so we do like to kind of spread things out around the town, because we do the hard clam survey. We know the different bottom types. We know which shellfish are dominating in those areas. So we'll do the clams where we just seem to be seeing more natural clam activity, and same thing with the oysters, because the oysters need different bottom conditions.
Okay. Anybody else want to talk about on bottom, off bottom, how to grow them best?
So a lot of oyster culturing kind of depends on your environment. So if you're in a high wind, high wave activity environment, you might not necessarily want to use surface gear due to gear loss. But a little bit of surface motion actually helps the shell grow and harden. So if you're using surface gear, you're getting the benefit of a little bit warmer water, but you're also getting the benefit of not having to tumble your oyster because the waves do it for you. If some of you probably aren't familiar with it, but there's this thing called an oyster tumbler. Basically, you send it down this steel mesh tube, and it chips the shell, and it helps harden them. And that's typically what you have to do if you're using bottom gear. But if you're using surface gear, again, the wave activity naturally does it for you. One thing I would like to talk about, we've been talking a lot about oyster reefs, shellfish reefs. I'd like to talk about the benefits of aquaculture. So aquaculture basically does the exact same thing as an oyster reef. The oysters in those cages, they filter the water, they clean the water. In addition to that, you can then harvest them, you get local revenue, profits. But one of the other things that oyster gear does, whether it's surface gear or bottom gear, is it actually provides habitat as well. So if you were to dive down on the gear on the bottom, you would see a whole community of fish down there. And as Mr. Westfall could tell you, not only does it improve fish species, it also provides habitat for the settlement of other shellfish species as well. And I don't know if any of you were here when Chuck spoke, it was probably a couple months ago, but he's also seen a rise in other shellfish species such as clams, and I will not divulge his location, but I can tell you from my experience, and I think every aquaculturist could tell you as well, the environment in which they put their gear in drastically improves as time goes on by the presence of the oysters and the gear as well. So same benefits as an oyster reef, but you get the economic benefits as well, and you get all that habitat benefit. So aquaculture is very, very beneficial to the environment in which it is done.
Let's talk a little bit about predators. It's been a huge problem in Oyster Bay. Frank M. Flower, which did one of the largest hatchery operations, closed it down in 2019, at least part because the predators were basically eating everything they put out there. Has that been a problem down here, and how do you deal with it?
The Great South Bay doesn't really have a problem with predators. Probably the main predator here would be blue crabs. But it's been very limited now because there's no stock for them to prey on. So, I mean, years ago, the crabs in the Great South Bay, the scungili, the conch shells and all that, they were all preying on it. The flounder would be here. They would gobble it because they go through the bottom and they'd eat up all the spat, all the small oysters. I mean, at one point, I did an experiment in a 55-gallon fish tank where I put sand, glass bottom, gravel, and something else. And I put 1,000 baby clams in each one of those habitats, and I dropped a couple of crabs in there, and they went through them in about an hour, ate every one of them.
Yeah.
They could find the crab's feet can sense the clam underneath it. So it's But since then, I mean, there's really nothing. We still have some pot fisheries out here for conchs and eels, but it's not a big problem here because we don't have any product.
And when you do these different experiments, how do you harvest? Is it hand raking or mechanical or some combination?
Well, the Great South Bay now is all hand harvest. It's all rake or tongs. Years ago, it used to be conveyor boats and dredge boats that used to, there were leases. Blue Point's company had the largest lease. The company that I worked for had 1,000 acres off of Heckscher Park, which is now what the town is trying to lease to oyster farmers. So it's kind of gone full circle, But we were oysters in the '60s, and they wouldn't live. What we were doing, we were basically doing spat on shell. We were planting them in the West Bay. We'd go out the next year and we'd bust them into pieces to go for the single oyster. We go out the third year, which would be the third year for harvesting, and they were all dead. They had somehow there was I guess it was a bacteria or a viral disease that came in called MSX, and that's what wiped out all the oysters. The Blue Point oyster was gone. That's when we switched to clams, and that was at the same time in the late '60s, early '70s when the clams were. I think we were 60-70% of the world's supply of hard clams came out of this bay.
All of you have touched a little bit on the economic impact of aquaculture, but let's get into that a little deeper. I mean, obviously, it provides jobs for growing and when they're successful harvesting. But what kind of economic impact are we talking about for Long Island overall?
I mean, we think with Town of Babylon, we still think it is at least a $3 million industry, with between commercial shellfishing as well as gear. We don't have much in the way of aquaculture in Babylon right now, so it's kind of limited more to like secondary with suppliers, that type of thing. But again, I think as time goes on, it's definitely going to grow.
There's a simple answer. 95% of the oysters eaten from the Long Island Sound region are from farms these days. I think I got that from Cornell. So that tells you already that the switch has already happened. With clams, I think it's very different. I think clams, there is a potential because clams are easier to harvest and manage. And when you drop a clam in the bottom, it burrows in. So if you have the right phytoplankton above, it's going to survive and it's easy to harvest. And I want to put in a plug for my local yacht club, the Stony Brook Yacht Club. For about 12 years or so, 15 years, we were raising seed. And we would raise oyster seed, and then probably I used to say we're committing them to death because then we'd drop them off the boat and they would undoubtedly die at the bottom in mud and things like that. But the clams, we made a gigantic clam population in the Stony Brook beach there. And it was so good that commercial clammers came in and they took it all away from us. And we were not able to defend it because there's this interesting problem, and that is if you have clean water and if you have clams, you cannot protect them. And a very good friend of mine oversaw a place in the state of Washington for 10 years, which the water was perfectly clean, and he got that closed. And if the New York State DEC allowed that, there could be large areas protected and for 10 years, and then we could build up bigger populations of clams. And I think that is one of there's some policy issues, but clams grow really well. And we still have places we know where the commercial clammers don't know that we can get them. But that's the interesting thing. They really can be grown very nicely. So clams and oysters are really quite different, I think, in the strategies you might take to develop them.
I mean, with Friends of the Bay, we've been working with the town of Oyster Bay government. They have shellfish management areas where they put either immature or over-mature shellfish. We get through the SOAR program. We get stuff through grants from Cornell Cooperative. But our concern was, I've actually organized diving surveys to go out and count what's on a square meter. And our concern is, once it really gets to a critical mass, there's going to be commercial guys or poachers in there. So we pushed the town, and they've agreed, they're redoing the town code. The Franken Flower lease expires in theory the end of September, and we're pushing them to create sanctuary areas that will be off limits for any harvesting other than for environmental benefit. If there's too much population there and they want to move it, that's one thing, but no commercial or recreational harvest whatsoever. And it's controversial trying to do that, but without that, we figured, you just sort of spinning your wheels.
Also, you don't want to also get in a situation where you're focusing so much on one species. You don't want to create a monoculture. Because again, we went through that. Look what happened with the scallop population on the east end when brown tide came up. They were the most affected by that. Again, we want to try and fix the last 100 years of screw ups we've done in the bay, and that's a big 100 years of mess it up. It's going to take us a while, to get things back again. But again, obviously take our shot at, again, oysters are growing well, clams are growing well. I know ISA experimented with scallops, unfortunately, because of their life cycle. They only live 2 years, so you've got to be successful or not. We've had, interesting thing when I first started getting into this with the town was just like with farmers, and you always hear about the plight of the farmers. Oh God, there's a drought this year. Now we're losing our crops because we're getting not enough rain or we're getting too much rain. And I would just always be amazed at our gear that in addition to growing the clams, that there was just some micro change in the bay that another species, it just favored that species. So we might have our gear covered with blue mussels. And that would not happen for another 5 years. So we would actually get, scallop spat naturally occurring in our clams, or another species would come in. So you have those annual changes as well that, you have to be able to deal with on these programs. So when you start focusing too much on one species, I think that's also something everyone has to be cautioned on, that, okay, what if brown tide comes in, or red tide, or a different situation, or water quality change? You could maybe not lose the crop, but have a significant diminishment on that particular year. Because again, it's essentially farming. Aquaculture is, it's farming. Conditions change, and you need to be adaptable with that.
You sort of touched on this, but my last question for the panel is sort of look in the crystal ball. Where is the shellfish population on Long Island going to be in 5 years, 10 years, 20 years down the road?
Well, as much as we have many species here, but there are really only a few shellfish that dominate. And Mercenaria, the heart clam, is the dominant burrowing, filter feeding clam of this region. There is also a surf clam, an open ocean species, and one in the Sound. But basically, it's that, and there are oysters. And oysters, we know where it's going because it's already gone, and that is it's going to farming. And so here in Great South Bay, I think one has to think about to what degree farming can be increased, and would that have a benefit? And that involves simple calculations. We did these calculations about 10 years ago, and they were pretty simple. There's not much to do. You can get some benefits from that. You can also get benefits that are economic, and they're worth considering. With clams, it's more complicated, and clams have tremendous benefits. Stirring up the sediment oxygenates the sediment, and that allows all the other species to thrive, and that's the dominant species. So I think that there you really have to start thinking about that. You have to craft your strategy to the species biology. And with oysters, the big problem is that the mechanics of making an oyster reef is really hard. First, you have to have larvae in the water. In New York Harbor, larvae in the water are almost non-existent. And for some reason that I cannot explain, in Tappan Zee, where the salinity is way too low, there's a gigantic population of oysters there, and they've survived for a long time. And actually, Flower & Sons brought a lot of oysters there in the 50s, because when they were having a failure in western Long Island Sound. So a very interesting story. But oyster, and there's many of you probably know about the Million Oyster Project that is planting oysters in New York Harbor. Now, whether that will sustain depends on whether there ever will be enough larvae produced in the water. Chesapeake Bay, there's larvae everywhere in the water. So if you put oyster shell in Chesapeake Bay, you're going to get oysters. So you have to craft your strategy to the ecology of the local place, the water quality, but one has to always realize that filter feeding is really good for water quality. I think everybody who works with shellfish knows that to be true. So if you could flip by increasing filter feeding, that will improve water quality everywhere. That's a good thing.
What about, I know Oyster Bay started a project to collect shellfish shells and put them back to create reefs artificially. Does that work or not work well, do you think?
It works well if there are larvae already there. So for example, in where I live, in Stony Brook, New York, there is quite a bit of oyster settlement there. I have an oyster reef right near my house, and I'm not telling you anywhere my house is, because people already know about it, and they're bringing out bags of oysters. It's about an 80-foot long reef. It's unique, I think, in all of Long Island Sound, and it's in a closed creek, as it turns out. So I've lost the track of the question.
Well, does creating an oyster reef from recycled oyster or clam shells work?
As long as there's larvae in the water,
Okay.
it works beautifully. In Long Island Sound, there are larvae in the water. Down here, no. So
Okay.
it depends where you are. New York Harbor, not likely.
Oysters require hard bottom. They want to set on something. If they go underneath, or you'll never find an oyster bed around a mussel bed, because the mussels will suffocate them.
Right.
But with the clams they burrow in the ground and they go up and down. They're susceptible to barometric pressure. When a storm comes, clams go down deep to protect themselves. When the barometric pressure goes up, they come up out of the bottom. And doing that, it's like a farmer plowing his fields. So it makes more room for just what he was talking about. It makes more room for more clams. But if you have enough clams in the area, a set of oysters could go on top of that. They will live together. The clams will keep the bottom soft, but they'll also keep it firm for the oysters to set on.
So collecting shells and putting them back on the bottom is a good thing?
Makes for a hard bottom.
Good.
Yeah.
Okay. Any other crystal ball projections? Oops.
I don't see, I think we've potentially at least turned a corner in terms of the negative impacts that have been to the bay and to water quality between the last 50 years of environmental regulation. Pretty much all of the areas already been built out. Like I said, a lot of damage. The statues of Robert Moses all over the place, but he actually closed 2 inlets to create Ocean Parkway, to create Jones Beach, and then dug out 20 miles of the state boat channel to have fill for Ocean Parkway, which took a lot of time for those impacts to go in the bay. For town of Babylon, our entire waterfront is developed. We have the highest building density in Suffolk County in terms of township. We have more houses per acre than any town, but we finished that in the 70s. Not that I'm not going to say I'm a supporter of sewering or anything, but more and more houses are on public sewers. I grew up in the northern part of town. My parents' house was built in 1959 with cesspools. That house still has cesspools. It's 5 miles from the bay, and the nitrogen plumes coming from the north part of the bay, the town are feeding the nitrogen going into the bay. The county is just looking into sewering those areas. It took 50 years for that water to make it down to the bay. Once they're hooked up, it's going to take 50 years for those plumes to just naturally work their way out. So I think we turned a corner in that respect. Unintended consequences, I hear, again, we've been following the whole artificial reef programs. Again, we don't have a breeding population of oyster, so that's academic at that point. You can dump all the oyster shell you want in the bay. We don't have a breeding population, not going to be picking anything up. But there's unintended consequences, not consequences, but unintended results. Town of Islip has been doing their leasing program for a long time. They're over by Snake Hill and West Fire Island. We are now finding natural sets of oysters in Fire Island Inlet. So those aquaculture oysters are breeding, they are spawning, and we are getting unintentional sets. Will that turn into Everybody's familiar with Fire Island Inlet. As you're avoiding the sandbars trying to make your way out there, there's a massive sandbar off the houses at Oak Beach. We're seeing settlement there. That could become an oyster reef in 10 or 15 years. Used to be mussels. People found out about it, wiped it clean. Now it's a perfectly sandy sandbar. That is something that was not intended. The leasing program was a commercial leasing program. This was just for people to do small-scale aquaculture to get fish, shellfish to market. If there was a benefit from this that was not planned, I mean, I'll take it. And it's very, very possible that it may have a positive benefit that nobody thought about.
Okay. Any last crystal ball projections?
Oysters will set on anything hard. If you go on any of the bulkheads up and down in Islip Town, and in our bulkhead, we replaced the bulkheads one year, and we pulled out this was the creosote, the bad stuff, and there was oysters all stuck to the side of them. Now, these things were huge, and they were spawning every year, but they were in a basin, so they didn't live. But they'll spawn on a glass bottle. They'll set on a glass bottle. They'll set on anything that's hard that they'll set on. So, and they'll horizontal, vertical, they'll set on it. They'll even underneath. When we're setting oysters in our hatchery, we use marble. We set marble down, and we put the oysters in there when they're ready to set, and we take them out the next day, and we take them off with a razor blade because we want single oysters. And what ends up happening is you turn that marble upside down, and there's more to the bottom of it stuck to it. How they got there, I have no idea. But they'll set everywhere.
So are you optimistic for the future?
Yeah. I mean, the one thing that I don't want to get in trouble here, but it's overdevelopment. As the bay has gotten worse, it's because the seashore has been overbuilt, overdeveloped. Things have changed like that, but I really believe now that people are paying attention to that. The moratorium on building, apartments and condominiums on the water are wonderful, but they're taking away the natural habitat. If it wasn't for the fact that we have, the Connecticut River here, but we have Heckscher State Park, we have the WORC camp, we have West Sayville Golf Course, we have LaSalle Military Academy, all along the Great South Bay that's untouched. And I think that's the only reason why this place isn't a sewer.
Okay.
So we need to stop that.
Tobi, you have any crystal ball you want to share?
Well, I mean, if you look at the statistics, the aquaculture industry is continuing to grow. There are some roadblocks, specifically financially. One of the issues with aquaculture is, you have to wait 2 years before you can harvest your crop. So there's a big upfront cost, and I know that's a major hindrance. I know Peconic Land Trust is trying to initiate, or is in the works of initiating, a grant program that will help with infrastructure and gear, so that should be very helpful. But I think on Long Island, the aquaculture industry is the future of the shellfish industry here. And as we've gone over again and again, there are shellfish in a cage have the same benefit as shellfish on the bottom. But at least when they're in the cage, you know where they are, and you can go and harvest them, and then that brings in the revenue for the local communities. So really, support your local aquaculturist, and buy local, and eat oysters.
Okay. Something else?
So since you've said it, I just have to say something that's just the opposite, just for the sake of being the opposite. Reduced nitrogen. That's reduced nitrogen input. Everybody knows that is the major thing that must be done on Long Island. There are sewer strategies, there are septic tank strategies, there are use strategies. That's number one. Number two, create spawner sanctuaries. Now that's really hard to do for oysters, but it is easy as pie to do for clams, because we have creeks all over Long Island that are even closed that have tons of clams. Do biology, do theory, see where the larvae will go by natural movement of water. And that's being done by Chris Gobler and his group and others on Long Island. And we have one apparent striking success in Shinnecock Bay. That could happen in Long Island Sound. That could happen on the South Shore. And we could get clam populations back in many, many bays that way. So I think really we have to be multiple strategy oriented. Not think that there's one solution. I think there's several solutions. But cleaning the water is the one thing that must be done, and we have not done. And we even have ways of doing it, but it's slowing down. I thought 4 or 5 years ago that Suffolk County was going to change completely because there were all sorts of ideas about reducing nitrogen, subsidizing people to change their septic tanks, and this is basically practically stopped, even though the methods are there. They can be done.
Well, hopefully the voters in September and November will approve.
We're hoping for that.
To do that.
We're hoping, and I hope it'll happen.
Good.
But there has to be not only voters voting, there has to be implementation.
Right.
And implementation is very difficult. Don't think it's easy. It's not.
Yeah, because I know Nassau County has a grant program. I just replaced the 50-year-old cinder block cesspool with state-of-the-art system, with a $20,000 Nassau grant, which is the kind of thing I think you'll see in Suffolk if it passes.
We have that program in Suffolk, but it's extremely limited. I thought it was going to be universal, and it's very limited.
Okay, we'll see what happens in November.
Thank you for your comments. I know there are a few more questions out in the audience, and our speakers will stand around for a little bit afterwards, but for the sake of respecting everybody's time, it is close to 11 o'clock, and I just have a few remarks to wrap up. First, thank you very much to our panelists and our moderator. As always, a very interesting conversation. I did want to mention again that Bill's books are available for sale up front. Thank our sponsors, the New York League of Conservation Voters and Blessings Hospitalities. And before we end, I'd just like to invite Rihanna Quinn-Roddy up to our podium. She has some information about our upcoming events. There are 2 speaker series coming up, but she'll speak to you about the super fun one.
Thank you, Robin, and thank you to our speakers and our moderator for another phenomenal speaker series. And thank you, Robin, for organizing. Ladies and gentlemen, as I think you know, I'm on the board of Save the Great South Bay. I've been a board member for, I don't know, Robin, about 4 or 5 years now, I believe. And my career took me, I grew up on this bay, as did Robin and Todd and most of the people on our board. And I water skied here. My brother put himself partially through, helped put himself through medical school, clamming on the bay every summer. And my career took me overseas for about 25 years in Europe and Asia. When I came back, I could not believe the state of our bay. It was amazing, the transformation from when I grew up here to when I returned. And so that prompted me to do something, to join the Great South Bay. I looked at a couple of organizations to join, and the reason that I joined Save the Great South Bay is Save the Great South Bay are doers. They make things happen. And I think that you can see through our oyster sanctuaries and our oyster gardens to cleaning up 50 creeks up and down the South Shore, to our unified water study, which will be an amazing asset for our region, to all the other programs. They're doers and they make things work. And all of these programs take a lot of resources to conduct. And I would say easily 95% of the resources that we get go to our programs. And so, we just need to support the Great South Bay, and the reason I'm up here right now is asking each and every one of you to do just that. We have planned a very exciting oyster ball in September. It will take place at the mansion at Timber Point on September 14th. Robin has and her team have put flyers on your table. It's maybe one way to give back to our organization. We don't charge for speaker series or anything else we do to the public, but we are asking for your support because we really need some operational funds. Our resources go to our programs, and this is one way that you can support us, give back by enjoying a beautiful evening at the mansion at Timber Point on September 14th at the Oyster Ball. It'll be a beautiful dinner with a lot of fun and dancing and tons of oysters. So please consider this request. We'd love to see you all there. You are the people that make this happen. We have great sponsors and we have great support from other organizations, but it's really grassroots that we need right now at our events. So the individual ticket sales have opened. You can go to our website. You can use the QR code that's on the flyer at your table. And we really look forward to your support and seeing you at our first annual Oyster Ball. Thank you.
Thank you, Rihanna. We're really excited about that project. And I did want to give a shout out to one of our sponsors who's in the room today. That's Reckler Equity. And they are a major sponsor of the Oyster Ball, which allows us to make this event happen. So thank you. So with that, I'm going to conclude our event. Please feel free to help yourself to a snack on the way out. Say hello to our panelists. If you have any direct questions for them, feel free to ask. Thank you so much for joining us.